Hello, creative badasses. I'm Tasania Odette of TasaniaOdette.com and the Inspired Writers Tribe Facebook group. Today we're going to talk about writing craft, specifically talking about dialogue. Stephanie had a question about writing accents into dialogue, so I figured that today's live chat will be all about just dialogue in general and how to craft better dialogue and dialogue that's believable. Learning how to craft more sophisticated or, using best practices with dialogue really helped my writing just step up a notch and to be just so much more fluid and so much easier to read and a lot easier to write too, because I kind of knew what the best practices were and what was going to really make my dialogue shine. And dialogue is such a huge part of writing. It's a great way for us to deliver things that are happening in a book instead of, writing chapters and chapters of this is what happened, actually showing things happening, like the events unfolding in your book through dialogue and interactions between characters is such a great and really interesting way to portray that to the reader, because it's so fun for a reader to actually get into watching something unfold. And that's kind of what that show versus tell, show don't tell that I talked about in the last video when I was giving some recommendations on books about craft is that's showing what's happening instead of just, telling, like instead of just saying, this is what happened, blah, 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 here's what happened, let me tell you a bunch of backstory, actually showing it, like instead of saying, Amy was having a bad day. Like you can actually show a conversation with Amy having a bad day. Like Amy rushes into the office and slams her briefcase on the desk. Her assistant says, what's going on? And, Amy's face is beet red, already right there. We just showed she's obviously having a bad day, and we showed it through action and through dialogue from her, her assistant saying, what's going on, and we can craft some dialogue around that to show her explaining what happened. Like, I just got rear-ended by a guy, and the principal just called me and said that my son was pulling some girl's hair. That's obviously she's having a bad day, and you can show that through action and through dialogue. So that's an example of how you can how having better dialogue can really make your work shine. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Some easy tips to get into that. And if for those of you who don't know me, I'm a fantasy author publishing my first book in 8 days. I'm so excited. And I'm also a mindset coach. And so that's why I'm here. I like to help people get over their fear and get on with writing their novels. And some of that is mindset and some of that is practical strategy. So today's one of those practical strategy videos. All right, and I'm a little under the weather, so I might be a little out of it, but I'm usually pretty goofy on these videos anyways. I'm always talk pretty fast. I'm a little loopy sometimes, but I do think I'm a little overworked from working on my launch, so I might just hang out with you guys for a little bit here and take the rest of the day as a self-care day, because that's really important. You guys have heard me talk about that a lot, the importance of self-care, balancing your energy as a writer, as a creative, and just as a person. So I gotta walk my talk, and I gotta take care of myself. So anyways, let's get into the video. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what Stephanie addressed. She asked about how to add in accents, and that's a really cool thing. And it's not something I personally have played around with for my own characters, but it's something that I've seen done really well, and it is something that I keep in mind when I am writing my characters. And it just basically goes on to your characters, expressing your character's personality and showing characterization. For example, you can do this without using accents in particular. For example, you have certain characters who talk a certain way. One of my characters is very snooty and very bossy. And I show that, she talks differently than Cora, who is a little more put together. She's a little more introverted. She's a little more kind. She's still kind of cold with strangers, and she keeps people at a distance, but I show it in a different way, where my first character, the snootier one, her name's Marillo, she has a lot more bite to her words. She's a lot more outwardly feisty, where my other character, Cora, even though she keeps people at a distance in a similar way, she does it through silence a little more. So you can show things like that. You can show whether someone is, very hoity-toity, but through their speech and through how they talk and through how they address people. You can also show if someone is If someone's a little more playful, for example, I'm writing a medieval fantasy, a medieval style fantasy. So, you know, you'd expect your royalty to speak a certain way, but I have another royal character who is, he's not quite as refined as the others. And I show that through his speech. He doesn't use big words, for example. You'll never hear him say a big word. And if I catch myself writing a big word and I'm like, I gotta dumb that down a little bit, because that's what fits the character. And so when you're writing accents, it's in a similar way. And whenever you do any of this, you don't want anything over the top. For example, I wouldn't write my bossy character just being bossy every sentence. Like every single sentence an insult would get really annoying for the reader. And it wouldn't be very believable, because believable characters aren't just, you know, they're not real people in real life aren't just black and white. You know, a bossy person isn't just always bossy and snooty all the time. She's got other things underlying that. And your characters are going to be like that too. So you don't want to just paint them into a corner and just have, you know, the sensitive character crying and whining every single sentence. And you don't want the bossy characters having an insult in every sentence. You want to balance it. And that's similar with writing accents when I've seen it done well. The books that come to mind are Outlander, which I've watched the show more recently than I've read the book, and I only read like half the book. So my memories of how they do it is more, right now I'm thinking more of the show. But Harry Potter is excellent when it comes to accents. All the different characters, like for example Hagrid, and then some of the other characters like, I don't remember who it is, but there's some that say, you know, instead of saying Harry, they'd say Airy, and they'd spell it Arry, and you know that person, that's their accent. And there's some other words in there that when I first read it, I was like a little confused. I'm like, what are they trying to say? And I realized that they were trying to, J.K. Rowling was portraying an accent or a way of speaking for a certain character. And Hagrid is great for that. You can read some of his dialogue sentences and see how she has written that in, because it's not over the top. You can understand what he's saying, but the way she writes, you know, a few words interspersed here and there just really express this character. You can almost hear his voice when you're reading it. And that's what I think good accents and dialogue, that's what it'll do, is it helps you, like, you can hear this voice and you can hear the accent and you expect it once you start getting to read more of this character's dialogue. You expect that voice to come out. When it comes to Outlander, I just finished watching season 3, so that's like pretty fresh on my mind, but they do great with that. Every single word in the book or in the show isn't Gaelic, but they pick certain words like Deniken, which is, you know, I don't know. Bairns, they say bairns, which is babies, but they take these certain words and they consistently use them with, you know, an accent, and they, you know, they spell it out. I'm not super familiar with like Gaelic or whatever, so I'm not sure like if that's, I'm assuming that's classical spelling, but I'm not an expert in that, so I can't say. But when you're reading it, you know, it can be kind of confusing, which is why I say don't go over the top. You don't want like every other word to be in this accent or a different language. But once you see it used consistently, you kind of get it, you know, like the Deniken. I Deniken, you know that they're saying like, oh, I don't know. And then bairns, I didn't know what that meant for a long time, and I realized they're talking about babies. So that's what I would say. I would suggest when you're writing accents, or, you know, trying to put in different languages into your dialogue or into your book in general, is to think about some very specific ones that you can use that aren't over the top, that you can use consistently. Like, for example, like in Harry Potter, if you had a character who always called him Airy, he'd always say Airy Potter every time. You wouldn't, you know, sometimes say Harry. He'd always use his accent, Airy, and maybe you'd find 3 words that consistently that character uses. And Stephanie was asking about like a New York accent, like a Brooklyn accent. So I would think about, you know, what are some really good standout words that this character is going to use consistently, and figure out how to write them. Figure out a way of spelling it that's not over the top. You know, you don't want it to be slapping your reader in the face, but you want it to, you definitely want it to show some of that characterization. If that's something you're interested in, writing accents in a dialogue, or in a book in general, think about some spellings that portray that. And if you're not sure, if you're a little uncertain, think about some other books, or even look them up that have used similar accents, and flip through it and see how they've used it. Which words have they chosen to use in an accent? I'm sure there's been tons of books that have used a Brooklyn accent and portrayed a character that way. But yeah, like I said, don't go over the top. Just think of a couple words that really express that character's personality, that you can hear their voice when they're talking. But yeah, every single word doesn't have to be accented, but just something's like that's their signature. That's their signature in their voice, So I hope that gives you a couple ideas of where to start on that. I think that's super exciting, writing accents in dialogue. That's, again, like I said, that's not something that I've particularly done in my book, but I have been interested in it, and it might be something I'll be doing in future books. So I might be right there with you someday. So next we're going to talk about, dialogue tags. Dialogue tags was something that really helped me make my dialogue a lot more sophisticated. And when I say dialogue tags, I mean said, asked, blah, blah, blah. One of the first things that I learned, which was very surprising to me, was that the modern standard is that you use said. You can look up a ton of synonyms for the word said, and they are, these super fancy, cool words. And the thing is, that's not modern practice anymore. When you're reading maybe a children's book or a middle grade, a younger book, you'll see that a little more where they say, I found a dog, Emily exclaimed. They use different words. They use a lot more alternatives to said. And I've been noticing that a lot because I read to my daughter. And I'll be reading these children's book, and the writing it's so much different than when you're reading a novel. But a lot of us, at least me, when we start writing, we're still kind of thinking about the books we grew up on, which might be children's books. And that was one of the most mind-blowing. I'm like, what? You mean I'm not supposed to look up other words besides said? And a lot of times we've even been taught this, even in school, to try and use different words other than said. Because for, back in the day, that was a practice, was to use exclaimed and announced and all these other words besides said. But the standard practice is use said or asked. Do I have a dog? Sarah asked. I don't know. She should know if she has a dog, but you can use asked. Asked or said is the standard practice. The other thing is that you don't have to use them all the time. You only use a dialogue tag when it's not clear who's speaking. So if it's in a conversation between two people, you don't have to say, I'm hungry, Amy said. What do you want for breakfast? Mom said. I want cereal, Amy said. Well, what kind of cereal, Mom said? You don't have to do that. The first two is enough to carry you through a few more before you need another dialogue tag. Another way to avoid having too many dialogue tags is to show beats of action. And this was one that, oh my gosh, this one made my writing so much better. Because when I first heard that, you should only use said. If you want to use these other ones here and there, make it sporadic. You don't need to use them all the time. I know a lot of us think they make our writing sound prettier, and maybe it does, but it kind of stands out as a rookie mistake, which is something I learned from, learning about writing craft, which is shocking. I'm like, what? I thought I was supposed to make my writing prettier. So anyways, when I read that, I was like, but it's going to be like said. There's going to be so much said. Like, that's going to be so annoying. I'm going to hear that all the time. And then I started learning about beats of action in dialogue. And, for example, this would be something like, I'm hungry, Amy said. What do you want for breakfast? Asked her mom. Her mom asked or whatever. Amy went to the fridge and stared inside it. I think I'll have cereal. I didn't say Amy said. I showed a beat of action of her doing something. And then since that was in that same sentence, you knew it was her speaking. So I didn't need to say she said. And you could continue on. Her mother stood next to her at the fridge, grabbed some milk. Sure. This is the dumbest dialogue ever, but I'm just trying to give you an example. It's totally off the cuff here, but you get the idea, even though that's not the greatest storyline there. You get the idea is that you can actually show beats of action. And again, this isn't something to overdo. You don't need to be like, Amy raised her eyebrows. Are you sure? Her mother put her hands on her hips. Yes, I'm sure. Amy scratched her forehead. I don't know. You just do it to add a little bit of spice here and there, especially if your conversation is starting to get, it's starting to get too long to where you're not sure who's speaking. Throw in some action beats here and there. And yes, throw in some said here and there. That's okay too. But you don't need to use said you only use said when it's unclear who's speaking. And it's clear who's speaking if you're showing them doing an action and you're expressing who it is. Amy versus her mom. We know which one. If we just use she, then we're not going to know who's talking. But we have Amy and we have her mom. We're showing them doing some action and throwing some dialogue in there. So that was one of the tips that just like, oh man, I was so amped up when I learned that. And I started editing my book's dialogue and it was so much better. So let's see, I'm going to look at my notes here. And then another thing is that, I talked about this a little bit in the last video about showing emotion through dialogue and action. For example, I talked about earlier, I can't remember what name I used, but let's use Amy again. Amy stormed into her office and slammed her briefcase on the desk. I didn't need to say Amy walked angrily into her office because she stormed into her office and she slammed her briefcase on her desk. You can tell she's angry. So I'm using action to show how she is feeling, to show her emotions instead of saying, Amy did this angrily or Amy did this sadly. You could say, tears streamed down Amy's eyes. Her shoulders sank. You can tell she's sad. I don't have to say Amy sat down in her chair and she was sad. You can say Amy sulked into her chair. Tears streamed down her eyes and her shoulders fell. That shows sadness and it shows it so much clearer and so much more emotional, unless your reader gets so much more emotionally involved in the story than just saying she did something sadly, happily, angrily. What kind of physical traits can you show that actually express that even better and even clearer? And the way this relates to dialogue is that a lot of us tend to overdo it. At least I did. I would say, for example, let me just think of one. Like I hate you, she said angrily. You don't really need to say she said angrily because saying I hate you is angry. Like I can't even say that without feeling like the energy of that. Like, ooh, that's an angry sentence to say. Or like, are you sure? Amy asked quizzically. You don't need to say that because are you sure means that she's uncertain about something. And if you do think that maybe what you're saying isn't clear enough, like for example, if you say you've got to be kidding me, it could be portrayed, you've got to be kidding me, or it could be you've got to be kidding me. And maybe you want to, there's a way around that. You could say, you've got to be kidding me, she said happily. But a better way to do that is, Mary laughed. You've got to be kidding me. Mary laughed. And then here's her dialogue. You've got to be kidding me. So she's saying it in more of a funny way. Or Mary rolled her eyes and tossed her hair. You've got to be kidding me. Something like that. Something that shows this easy. It's funnier. And then if you want it to be angry, Mary's hands clenched into fists and she stomped her foot. You've got to be kidding me. That she's not going to say, Mary hand clenched into fists and she stomped her foot. You've got to be kidding me. That's just characters or readers can pick up on stuff where sometimes we want to over explain something, but readers are intelligent and they can pick up on the dialogue and the action and relate them and figure it out without having to oversimplify it and over explain it by she said angrily or she said happily or and there are times when you're going to want to say confusedly or and that's fine, but when your entire dialogue is just like confusedly, angrily, happily, sadly, quizzically, it gets a little over the top, and you will see that a lot more in kids books. So if you're writing a children's book or middle grade, then you don't have to worry about this as much. But when you're writing a longer length, like a fiction novel, it is more standard practice to show more action, show more dialogue instead of explaining it. Show us how that person is feeling through action and dialogue, through their conversation, through their physical traits, instead of, telling us. You can tell us, but it's so much more fun when you explain it, and it's a lot more fun for the reader. Start noticing that in the books that you're reading. Start seeing where, especially modern books, if you read something old, you're going to see these things tons, because that's what the standard was now. But look at some really, high-selling modern books, and you'll see how they use stuff like that, how they use, less dialogue tags, how they use action, and they portray emotion through action and dialogue. So try and see that in what you're reading, and you'll start to pick up on how to use that. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is point of view. This is something that I learned after my very first draft. I wrote my very first draft, and I realized that the point of view I was using wasn't modern. So first of all, let's talk about there are 3 standard points of view. There's first person, which is I walked to the store. I said, it's a story that revolves around the character and it's being seen through their eyes. The next point of view would be third person, which is he or she. So it would be explaining it through, you're still usually seeing it through one character's eyes, but you're saying he or she. If our story is about Mary, it's going to be, Mary did this, and then she did this, and then she did that. Whereas if it's about Mary, but Mary is telling the story, it would be I did this, and you wouldn't interchange those. You've got to stick to, one point of view. Are you going to do first person, or are you going to do third person? That was a big trick for me, because I had interchanged them a lot during my first draft when I was 18, and I had to fix that. Now the third one is one that is not modern anymore. It is not considered standard practice. It is not as used as often, and that's omniscient. Am I pronouncing that right? Omniscient. And that is more of the 19th century technique of a narrative. That would be like a Jane Austen novel. What's the first word in Emma? It's like it is commonly known that a woman is I'm butchering it. You know what I mean. If you've read Emma, it's like, I wish I knew the quote. Ignore me on that. But it's not talking about, it is telling a story about, it centers around Emma, but you do hear the things about, what's going on in her father's head, a little bit about what's going on in her sister's head and her mother's head, but it mostly revolves around Emma. Am I getting Emma and Pride and Prejudice confused? I think I am. Anyways, and that's something that when I wrote my first book, I used that omniscient point of view. So it would be, Taryn said this and he was thinking about this. We got inside his head. The next sentence would be Cora did this and this is what was in her head. I was constantly bouncing from one head to another, which is fine if that's the point of view you want to go for, but it is not considered the modern standard. Some novels still do this. For example, I'm reading this book called 1Q84, and it centers around 2 different characters' point of view. But every once in a while, we will get this narrative that's about, getting us into another character that the point of view character of that chapter wouldn't be able to know. They wouldn't know this. It's like, a little secret, like a little tidbit of information about a character who's not one of the main 2 characters. And that's just not super modern, but it can be done, and it is still done. And if that's what you want to do, then, you can do it well. One of the standards is for, or there are a couple different ways to use the first and third. First and third point of view is pretty similar. Now, a lot of us really want to write multiple point of views, and it's kind of disempowering to hear that the omniscient is not really the standard anymore, and that's not, a lot of people aren't into that point of view anymore. Well, how do you write from multiple point of views? There are lots of ways. I write from multiple point of views. I write with scenes, and every scene, I write from first person, so mine's I did this, I did that. So I always label at the beginning of a scene, if it's going to change point of view, I label who is narrating that point of view. So it would say Taryn, and this scene or chapter is going to be all from his point of view. The next might say Cora, and it's going to be all from her point of view. The Time Traveler's Wife did that really well. Every scene had one of their names in the front of it, and that's who would be narrating that scene, and it would be from their perspective. We would be seeing everything from their point of view. Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones does this really well, where every chapter is labeled with whose point of view it's from. There are a lot of other books like the Wheel of Time series, or at least the first one that I'm reading right now, The Eye of the World. It is from multiple characters' point of view, but you know, this one's from third person. You know whose chapter it is because it'll start with Rand said this or did this. The next one would be, you know, it shows the name of the person pretty close in there, and you get a really quick idea of whose mind you're in that chapter. So that's a really good way to kind of to go with the modern standard, but still write from multiple characters' point of view. So for example, when you're in that chapter and you're in that scene, for example, we're in one of my characters, Taryn. We're in Taryn's scene, which means we see everything from his perspective. We know what's going on in his mind. We're going to talk about how he feels, how he's perceiving and experiencing things, and we see how he's perceiving and experiencing other characters, but we don't get to know anything that he wouldn't know in real life. So this is when you write those type of scenes, you've got to step into that character that you're writing about and write from that person's perspective. You wouldn't know what's going on in Cora's head. You're not in her head. You're standing next to her and you're having a conversation with her. So you get to see how what her expression looks like. You see her body movements. You hear her tone of voice. So there's a lot you can pick up on, but you can't say, for example, you know, Taryn asked Cora a question. Cora thought about it for a while, wondering what he was talking about and feeling like she was super hungry. Like, Taryn doesn't know that, you know, she could, you know, rub her tummy and make a wrinkle her nose, and he can respond to that and say, Cora looked like she was hungry. He's responding to that. And then when you go to the next character's point of view, then you flip it to Cora. Now Cora, we're in Cora's mind. We're in her mind only. And now we're responding to what Taryn's doing. We're not going to bounce back into his brain. We're going to respond to how he's talking to us, picking up on body language. It's time to step into that character. So that's a good way to do it. If you don't want to write multiple point of view, that's totally fine. You can still pick up on so much. There are tons of books that are written from just one character's point of view, but have tons of characters in them. Think about The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games is written entirely from Katniss's point of view. Entirely. 3 books. But we know so much about Peeta. We know so much about Gale. We know so much about her family. The Hunger Games. We know so much about the community because we are experiencing all these people, all of these experiences through her. Same thing with so many other books that are, you know, it's sometimes when you don't really know about point of view at first, it's hard to even realize that there are these conventions around sticking with one character at a time, because we know so much about these characters that we don't even notice that we're not mind hopping into these other characters' minds. We're sticking with that point of view character and experiencing through body language, through, you know, the information that we're gathering through that character. So it's really cool. It can be a huge challenge. Rewriting my first draft was a huge challenge because my first draft was just all my characters' minds, all of them. You know, there were no chapter headings about what character was going to be speaking because everyone was speaking. I knew everything that was going on in everyone's head, and it was really confusing. When I reread that with the, you know, understanding of the modern conventions of dialogue and narrative and point of view, I was like, oh man, this is confusing. And I mourned for it because I wanted to be in all my characters' heads at once. But I also, you know, I wasn't confident that I could pull off the omniscient point of view very well. It overwhelmed me a little bit because I didn't have a lot of comp titles. There weren't a lot of titles that were similar to my book that had done it well. So I decided to do alternate narratives or alternate point of view in scenes and chapters, and that's worked out really well. I love it. So anyways, that is my little rundown of point of view. If that's something that you're learning about right now, like I said, it blew my mind, and I was like, oh my gosh, really? That's another thing I have to learn, but it did make my book so much more readable and so much better. So when it comes to, let's do a little example. When it comes to writing dialogue with point of view, like I said, we're experiencing Oh, I got paused for a minute. So like I said, we're experiencing from the point of view of a character. So we can get their thoughts, we can hear Taryn was thinking about his mom and was sad or whatever, and then we can see how what the other characters are looking like, what they're doing, what the body movements they're making. Like, for example, here's how we can kind of tie in everything we've learned today. Okay, so we're going to do, our point of view is Mary. We're going to use some action instead of dialogue tags. We're not going to use said in this. I'm going to give you a couple sentences. We're going to show action, and we're going to express it from Mary's point of view. And, I didn't put any accents in this little example, but you can play with that too. Anyways, okay, so Mary fidgeted in her seat, eyes darting around the room. Is everything all right? So you can tell, Mary's fidgeting in her seat, eyes darting around the room. She's nervous, right? I didn't have to say she's nervous, but I said how she's acting. She's fidgeting, eyes darting. Is everything all right? John furrowed his brow. There's something I have to tell you. I didn't have to say John looked worried. I said John furrowed his brow. So, he's kind of like frowning a little bit. There's something I have to tell you. Sweat prickled behind Mary's neck. Her heart raced. Okay, so we're in Mary's point of view, so we can tell how she's feeling. Sweat is prickling behind her neck. Her heart is racing. That means she's really nervous. She does not know what John's about to tell her. I didn't have to say said. I didn't have to say she's worried. I just had to say sweat sweat prickled behind her neck, and her heart raced. Okay, there's been a fire. So there's an example of all of that, everything we've talked about today, except for accent. I forgot to throw an accent in there, but, Anyways, that's all I have for today. I'm losing steam. I'm ready to take a little break. Launch week has been crazy. 8 days until my book gets published, so, oh my gosh, you guys, it's nuts. But anyways, I hope you guys are having a great week writing. If you have any questions or comments, just post them in the comments, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!